Bars loading. All right, so we should be connected to Facebook, and I'm going to go ahead and hit record for us on this side of things, if I can find that permission. All right. So thanks for joining us. This is SJ with Commission Shift, and I'm joined with Virginia Palacios, our executive director, and we are going to go through highlights from this morning's Railroad Commission open meeting. And these are roughly monthly open meetings, and they run through hundreds of agenda items in 30 minutes, sometimes 45. Today was more of a 30-minute. And so we're kind of slowing down and picking a few agenda items to highlight and talk about the repercussions, what these decisions mean with the Oil and Gas State Agency. So I'm going to pass it to Virginia, and you can take it away.
Thanks, SJ. Yeah, we'll start close to the top of the agenda at item number 6. This was an item about a fine for an operator that did not correctly designate their natural gas facilities as needing to be weatherized. It's called a critical infrastructure designation. And so this particular operator had some saltwater disposal wells, and it might be that the operator thought that they didn't need to file this form because the disposal wells aren't natural gas wells. They're not natural gas pipelines. But after, it looks like after some investigation, the Railroad Commission determined that they did know that they needed to file these forms, and regardless of whether they knew or not, they did not do it on time. And so this whole thing around weatherization of the natural gas supply chain and designating wells as critical infrastructure came about after 2021 when Winter Storm Uri hit the state and caused hundreds of thousands of power outages throughout the state. And so, sorry, 4.5 million power outages throughout the state. This resulted in hundreds of deaths, the largest carbon monoxide poisoning event in state history, and I think it was the costliest natural disaster in state history at that point in time. Of course, this year we had the Panhandle wildfires. Again, those were largely connected to orphaned wells that had not had their electricity disconnected. I'm not sure what the overall toll or the overall cost of that particular disaster was, but again, lots of big disasters that have been happening, and Winter Storm Uri was really, really big. Um, so after Winter Storm Uri hit the state, the legislature passed laws requiring natural gas supply chain operators to weatherize their infrastructure. And the reason for that is that the state power plants in the state of Texas get most of their fuel from the natural gas supply chain, right? And so most of our power ultimately comes from natural gas. When natural gas wells are producing natural gas, they also produce a little bit of water along with that gas. And when that water gets to the top of the wellhead, if it's freezing outside, as cold as it was during Winter Storm Uri, it can freeze and plug up the well and prevent gas from flowing out of the well. Similarly, the pipelines were also having problems, weren't warm enough, and they were getting plugged up, right? The gas couldn't flow through the pipelines. The compressor stations had shut off, and the gas couldn't get boosted to the power plants, right, the way it needed to be. Another thing that happens on natural gas well sites is each well site will have a flow line that goes from the natural gas well to a tank on site to store produced water that's produced from that well. Um, and then that water would need to get taken by truck to a saltwater disposal well. And so that's an important part of the whole supply chain. And one of the things that happened during Winter Storm Uri is the disposal wells were shutting down and those produced water tanks were shutting off flow from gas wells. And so this was a fine that was related to the saltwater disposal wells that dispose of produced water. It was $1,000 fine, which is the lowest end of the fine can be. But uh, the Railroad Commission staff were recommending this fine, and Commissioner Christian asked for more time to review the case and punted the decision to the next open meeting. So this was not decided today. We haven't had a lot of these fines come up before the Railroad Commission before. And so there's kind of a testing ground right now to see how the Railroad Commission handles these types of infractions by operators.
That was exactly the follow-up question I was going to ask Virginia, which is what's the sort of history of these fines for critical infrastructure designations having to do with like weatherization? Like these are, I guess, newer rules about weatherizing. So is that why there hasn't been a lot of things coming up in open meetings about it? And
Yeah,
what's your take?
and when items make it to this part of the agenda, this is like the first part of the agenda where the Railroad Commission is like having to make the decision. It means that they've gone through a lot of appeals already internally at the commission. And so this is kind of like the last bite at the apple for the company to see if the commissioners will weigh in their favor or not. We have seen these items come up on lower parts of the agenda, like the consent agenda, and that's stuff where operators might have they might have decided they're not going to fight it, right? And they'll just take the fine. Or there's another part of the agenda where maybe that is the consent agenda. It does get confusing. There's another part of the agenda where operators clearly have already negotiated with the commission, and they came to some middle ground on what the fine would be or what the penalty would be. And they agreed to it. And then that kind of just ends up the way it ends up. They're not going to appeal it. They're not going to bring it before the railroad commissioners for another special decision, right? So those have kind of gone by without us looking into it too much because it's not at that top part of the agenda.
I'm curious if you could tell us if someone has oil and gas structures on their property in some capacity, whether that's like pump jacks or whatever that is there a way for them to know if those are supposed to be weatherized or not? Like if they're looking out their window and they're seeing this equipment, do they, and it's not weatherized, can they visually tell if it's been weatherized? And separate question, can they tell if it's supposed to be weatherized?
Gosh, that's a great question. So the Railroad Commission rule is it's 3.3.65, right? And it's the critical infrastructure designation rule. That rule kind of sets like volume thresholds for how much a well would have to produce to be required potentially to be weatherized. A well has to meet those thresholds of how much gas it produces per day, but it also has to be listed on the electricity supply chain map. And the electricity supply chain map is not publicly available. It's not even available to state legislators. It's only available to people who sit on the it's available to certain agencies that feed into it, right? So like the Railroad Commission has access to it. I believe ERCOT has access to it, and so does the Public Utility Commission. But interestingly, the Texas Energy Reliability Council, which was formalized in 2021 by the state legislature, is this body that has members of all three agencies. Well, ERCOT's not really an agency, it's like an NGO, a nonprofit entity. It has representatives of those three entities and people that they appointed to the council. And so the Railroad Commission approved certain people that they wanted to sit on the council. And some of the people that they approved to that council are people who profited the most from the Winter Storm Uri disaster. What's special about the Turk, if you want to call it that, TERC, is that it is not subject to the Open Meetings Act and it's not subject to the Public Information Act. So you can't witness their meetings, you can't do any open records requests about what they're doing. And so you have companies behind closed doors with regulators who have access to the entire electricity supply chain map. And so they can see from wellhead to power generators, how everything connects. And it's just a few select companies that have their representatives on that council. It's not open to just any company, and it's definitely not open to you and me. And so it would be hard for members of the public to know, hey, if I have a natural gas well on my property, should that be weatherized? I'm not sure. Some of the things that can be done for weatherization are visible. So one of the recommendations has been like heated housing over the wellhead, but not everything would be visible. You can imagine insulation, right, would be visible the same way you wrap your pipes for your plumbing. But one of the other things they could do is install a mechanism that would inject methanol into the wellhead. And I'm not sure exactly what that looks like. There are some resources from Gas Technology Institute on that, but you might not be able to tell.
Wow. So there were some other items we should probably move to. I'm seeing on our list, we were looking at items 9 through 22, having to do with the ability for operators to operate in Texas. So what happened with these?
So these are the P5 organization reports. Every oil and gas well operator in Texas has to have a P5 organization report. It's a report that they file every year that has the names of the head of the company on it, their address, their contact information. But they also have to file a list of all their inactive wells every year and show that they're in compliance with state rules. And so if an operator has an inactive well, they have like 6 different options for being able to get a plugging extension for that well. But when they file their P5 organization report, they have to show that they've complied with one of those options. And sometimes it's submitting just certain documentation, certain testing requirements, or it can be putting up additional financial assurance in case they go bankrupt. Um, and so 14 operators lost their P5s. Well, 14 were up for losing their P5s. I think 2 of them actually came into compliance before today's meeting. But the Railroad Commission was slated to take on about 300 orphaned wells. I haven't done the math post meeting, but they took on somewhere close to that many orphaned wells because of these operators not coming into compliance with those requirements. And that was just in the first part of the agenda. There's also just sort of the standard items that get approved without any discussion that came through in a later part of the agenda. We didn't tally up the numbers on those, but that was about 30 operators there also that lost their license to operate.
And so you're saying when they lose their license to operate because they didn't meet the standards or come into compliance, those wells that they were in charge of are then passed on as orphaned wells at that point? Or is that they officially they're added to the list?
Yeah, they're added to the Railroad Commission's list. And so the operators that lose their P5 in the bottom part of the agenda, it's possible they'll appeal it, they'll try to get a motion for rehearing and like give themselves more time that way. But it's like, once it makes it in front of the commissioners, if they haven't plugged their wells or put up additional financial assurance or something like that, then they could very well lose their license to operate. So they're definitely on track if they haven't already like just gone straight up bankrupt.
And could you speak to the standards? Like, what are we saying with the P5? What do they need to be doing? I've read in the past that these are not super high standards that people are being asked to meet. So could you speak to like some of what's expected?
Yeah, so to be able to get plugging extensions when you submit your P5 organization report, there's kind of 2 mechanisms. And so you could get a blanket plugging extension that applies to all the wells in your well population, or you could do individual well plugging extensions. So if you just have 1 or 2 wells, you might choose different methods for each. Under the blanket extensions, you're testing my memory now. Um, there's roughly 3 options. You can plug or reactivate 10% of your inactive well population. That's the most expensive option, so it's unlikely that operators are going to do that, but sometimes they do. You could put up additional financial assurance. So that's like a bond, but it could also be like a letter of credit or a cash deposit. And that additional financial assurance has to be equal to the Railroad Commission's estimated cost to plug your well population, or $2 million, whichever is less. And so we have this hypothetical scenario. If you had 100 wells and each of your wells was 10,000 feet deep, and it costs the Railroad Commission $10 a foot to plug your well, then that's a total of $10 million to plug 100 wells. So you could just put up $2 million, a bond for $2 million, and the Railroad Commission would be on the hook for $8 million of that cost if you ended up orphaning your wells. And so that option is set in statute like that. And so it's way behind the actual modern day cost to plug. Like the bonding amounts are not really enough to be able to make sure the Railroad Commission has enough money to plug wells on time. Other than that, there's like one more option, but it never gets used. Publicly traded companies can submit some of the same documentation to the Railroad Commission that they submit to the SEC. No one's ever used that option. Um, there's other things that inactive or that operators can do for individual wells. And one of those things is to show proof of a successful fluid level test or pressure test. We also think that some operators are falsifying those tests. And so there have been some proposals floated at the legislature to allow landowners to witness those types of tests to hopefully prevent some of that fraud. There's also an option to get a scientist or an engineer to say that the well has potential future economic value. And we think that this is a rationale that sort of like makes sense when you hear it, but when you look at the data, only around 1 to 2,000 inactive wells per year are actually reactivated, and that's out of a population of 115,000. So it's like 1 to 2% of all the inactive wells are ever reactivated. And there's also some data that came through from the Environmental Defense Fund where they looked at trends in inactive well reactivation, and they found that after 5 years of a well being inactive, only about 15% of those wells ever get reactivated. And when they do, the vast majority are marginal wells. So they're not producing very much anyway. And so it kind of draws into question, is it really worth it to let operators get plugging extensions indefinitely? There are even more options than that, but I'll pause there.
Yeah, so many of these connect to our legislative priorities, which might be a good segue to discuss those some. But what I'm hearing though is that to maintain your P5, you need to plug your inactive wells and prove that you are maintaining your active wells. Like, is there any kind of proof that you have to submit with your P5 that shows that you're being a responsible operator besides that?
I mean, and those are just options. They only have to choose one of those out of all the things that I listed. And so they don't have to do all those things. They just get to pick the one that's the easiest for them.
Oh, wow. So it is really like a menu of like, here's all these really good, responsible things to do, but you can just pick one and you can ignore all the other ones.
Yeah, and so by the time operators get to this place where they're losing their P5 for it, like they have had lots of opportunities and lots of choices to be able to come into compliance and get, a plugging extension and get more time. But it's really the end of the line if they get to this point and they haven't used one of those very easy options.
Got it. Okay. So maybe should we wait to talk about some of our legislative goals after we get through the rest of the agenda? Maybe we'll put a pin and come back to some of those. Okay, in that case, so some of the other things that happened, it was really a quick meeting, so I feel like we got through the bulk of what we were watching.
Yeah,
There
our debrief is going to be longer.
what?
This meeting's going to be longer than that meeting.
Yes, it will actually. We're already like approaching that time. But yeah, so there was a federal update that came at the end involving the EPA. Could you maybe summarize what that was? It's like the methane rule coming from the EPA.
Sure, yeah. So the Biden administration had passed a law requiring the EPA to implement a rule to limit methane emissions from the oil and natural gas supply chain. The Railroad Commission has appealed that rule. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality is slated to develop a state implementation plan for that federal methane rule this year. And so TCEQ apparently is joining the Railroad Commission in submitting some comments on the EPA's action around the rule. So they got a federal update today, the Railroad Commission did, from their federal attorney, and she said that EPA is reconsidering two portions of the final methane rule. And so that's kind of what's in play right now. They said that the challenge would be in abeyance for 120 days, and I'm not an attorney. I didn't Google it before this call, so I'm not sure what that means. But definitely some movement on the methane rule. The methane rule like should generally be safe because it was passed in law by Congress. So Congress would have to take action on that rule if they want to pull it back. Some experts have said that the methane rule probably won't be totally repealed because even big oil and gas operators like the rule. It kind of conforms to what they're doing globally, and so it might end up surviving after all this.
Interesting. And I didn't realize that the EPA could pull back something that they've already promoted or released, that they have that kind of flexibility. Is that just the power of the federal agency, or is it unusual?
No, I mean, it might be. So the Supreme Court kind of repealed this prior decision. It was called the Chevron Doctrine, which um, basically stated that federal agencies have the authority to kind of like meld rules based on kind of what they think is best and their expertise, as long as it kind of conforms basically to what Congress passed in a law. Um, but when the Supreme Court repealed the Chevron Doctrine, that means that federal agencies have to follow what Congress passed to the letter of the law, and they don't have as much leeway to interpret what Congress passed. And so it could be that there are portions of the methane rule that were maybe not conforming to the law that Congress passed, or that were kind of going beyond that. And so it's possible that Trump's EPA is kind of coming back to that and saying, actually, we're going to reconsider these two portions. So, and they're hearing arguments from both sides right now. The EPA is, and so they're going to be trying to kind of like meet in the middle at some point on all that.
I know Commission Shift has been working in collaboration with some other organizations to publish more resources and materials having to do with methane flaring. So that's still, I know, a really active conversation here in Texas is the effects of this flaring and, how much of it is necessary and how much of it is preventable. So this EPA decision will come back in a big way to what our landscape looks like in terms of emissions, right?
Well, and importantly, we published a report in September showing that the Railroad Commission's rules on venting and flaring from oil wells and gas wells are not really enforceable. Like they don't have any legitimate way to like limit, or they don't have any legitimate way to enforce the limitations that they put on operators. And the only way that they are enforcing the rules right now is to verify that operators submitted their paperwork on time. And so it's not really having any effect on how much operators vent and flare, and that's a problem. This EPA rule is going to require an end to routine venting and flaring for some of the larger operators by a certain date, and so that would be an improvement from what we have right now, which is really just a rule at the state level that was designed with a lot of loopholes in it and doesn't really have an effect on venting and flaring waste.
Here's to closing loopholes. So I think we could move to the public input part of the meeting. So this was, we had two people registered to speak, Skylar White and yourself. First, Skylar came up and had sort of some photos and an anecdote to share about what's happening on his ranch. He has over 200 legacy wells that are a lot of them are leaking. But the issue he brought today was a little bit different than the leaking well issue, which is its own huge kettle of fish. But can you speak to kind of what he brought up today?
Yeah, so and this is something Skylar has showed me on his ranch before, is that the Railroad Commission, even when they go in and plug wells, they tend to leave behind a lot of the equipment that existed on the surface. It can be pump jacks, it can be tank batteries. Sometimes there's power lines. He was talking about that today. Sometimes like pipelines, things like that. And they're just littering the ranch, you know? Um, they're supposed to haul it away, but they don't always follow through. And the Railroad Commission is kind of the end of the line on this. No one's holding them accountable. And so it seems like sometimes they're cutting corners, especially in these ranches that are in very rural parts of the state where no one's going to see it, right? So Skylar kind of brought this to them today and said, hey, like this stuff needs to be taken away. And then he asked, can he haul the junk off without getting in trouble? And so Commissioner Craddock just said, yeah, if you can get in touch with someone on our staff, they can help you with that. But it sounds like maybe they'll let him haul the junk away. The commission also likes to sell some of that old equipment, and they can recover some like salvage costs from that. And that goes back into the Oil and Gas Regulation and Cleanup Fund, which they use to plug wells and clean up sites. So it's possible they'll say, no, don't take it away. We want it so that we can sell it. But some of that stuff is so old, maybe they'll just let him take it. He can get some salvage on it and clean up his own property.
It sounds like, he hasn't gotten the answers from, he said the district office that he reached out to, which has to be frustrating that that question can't just be answered. And even today, it was passed off again well, someone else will answer that for you. And I do want to flag, I'm gonna mention Laura Briggs here because Laura tweeted right after the open meeting about a similar issue that she faced. And I want to quote the tweet. And I'm gonna quote it exactly. She wrote, "My ranch is a waste storage for the Railroad Commission also. We pay property tax here and our livestock and our kids live here. I have been told I can't legally move it, even at my cost, and there are no plans for the state to clean this up." And there's a photo. So you should check out our Twitter page for that, but we retweeted that. So it sounds like this isn't just an individual problem, but something that's a bit more widespread.
Yeah, and it's troubling that landowners are being told they can't do what they want on their own property with information, with equipment that has been left behind by both a state agency and a defunct operator. I think we have Laura on the phone here. Laura, do you want to say anything about this?
We'll let her come off mute if she's able to, but I do think it is troubling. And like, so when Skylar said, am I going to get in trouble? I think it's good to flag, like what he meant is, am I going to get in legal trouble? Because the Railroad Commission has threatened, in the past.
They've called
Or
the sheriff's office on him when he was on his own property. Yeah, I don't know if they've done anything else, but it's definitely been a threatening relationship with someone who is just trying to get his land cleaned up and trying to hold the commission responsible to their own duties.
right. And people may not realize when they sell mineral rights that they are going to have surface problems down the road, potentially.
Yeah, well, and in Texas we have split estate, right? So you can have a totally different mineral owner underneath the surface, and one person is getting far more benefit from that exploration than the surface owner, which has very little negotiating power in that kind of a lease. Importantly, there's a bill that came through in the Texas legislature last month that proposes to make it a constitutional right to explore for oil and gas. And that's concerning because we don't even have a constitutional right to clean air and clean water. And it really makes you wonder what that implication is going to be. And it looks like Laura is up. Laura, talk.
Okay, I'm here. So when one of the things is the operator here lost their P5. I've been battling them since 2013. So for over a decade, we've had pump jacks that aren't connected to anything, telephone poles falling, tank batteries where the bottoms have failed. I have a separator unit that's leaking, miles of the poly pipe fast line leaking. And it limits what you can do with your property. And we wanted to clean, can you all hear me? Okay, so we want to clean it up. It limits where you can put fences. It limits where you can put water lines. If my kids want to move out here, where do we put their home? And I mean, it's acres. It's acres. So I can be brave fighting this because my ranch is destroyed. Well, I have a French report calling me right now. I'm gonna go ahead and go back to Zoom. And out here, you know, the Railroad Commission will go onto their social media and say, look at this beautiful park that we did where there was this nasty oil and gas. And I'm like, wow, we would just like basic surface cleanup here. So we're not dealing with nests of rattlesnakes and rats living under this metal. And of course, it's an attractive thing for lightning. You get your cattle stepping in it and they get pipes on their feet. And then you've got to load them up and take them to the vet and get the pipes cut off their feet. The other thing is I've been active on TikTok and I've got people on Facebook Marketplace and TikTok going, I'll buy that from you. I'll buy that from you. And I'm like, you can't because they'll arrest me after all the crime that's happened out here. And I'm 120 pounds. What am I going to do to move tons of metal? I don't have a backhoe. I don't have a trailer. I don't have a cutting torch to come cut this stuff up, but there are buyers for it. So in my situation, I've met a woman and her business is buying used oil field equipment and selling it at auctions or scrapping it. And she gave me the price that she's getting approved of in a different district in Texas. So I'm going to put a bid together for her, submit it to my local District 8 office and say, this is flying in other parts of the state. Why can't we sell it for this here? But I'm 56 years old and I'm looking at this stuff still being on the ranch by the time I die of old age because I can't get it removed. And it's gross.
Yeah, and then it becomes your kid's problem later on, and that's not fair to them either. And so, yeah, we really need the Railroad Commission to open up the doors for landowners to be able to clean up their own property for
But
sure.
it's an income source. If we don't have the money to plug the wells, I think they could sell the 30-something pump jacks out here, scrap the tank battery, the tons of pipe, and use all of that to plug a couple of the wells out here. I mean, that's what we all do. We have a garage sale when we want something. So it's time for the state to be active with that. Good job at the meeting and really good job in this discussion. You're doing a great job. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Laura.
Yeah. I'm gonna mute so you guys can finish.
Okay.
Okay.
Laura, I think this is a good segue into the public input I gave today. Laura and I talked yesterday. I've been calling community members all week because Commission Shift is hosting a Capitol visit next week. And so we're just trying to open the door for folks from across the state to come in and talk to their legislators about issues like this. And so I was calling a lot of folks who are dealing with orphaned wells or some other problem related to oil and gas development. And Laura was not the only person who is really like actively dealing with this in real time and can't make it out because their time is all taken up by dealing with the problems on their land in the moment or being sick. And, to top it off, folks like Laura are very far away from Austin. Like it is a significant amount of time for people to be able to come out to Austin and talk about these issues from the parts of the state that have the most oil and gas development. And so, I talked today in my public input with the Railroad Commission about, the fact that the commission is so inaccessible and that we need to consider these layers that like prevent people from accessing government. But I also talked a lot about environmental injustice, right? And the fact that right now we have a couple of executive orders that came through, one from President Trump, another one from Governor Abbott. And they have language in there that sounds good, right? Emphasizing the importance of a government committed to serving every person with equal dignity and respect, and complying with the colorblind guarantee of both state and federal constitutions. But what they're doing with these executive orders is trying to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion, and trying to close off conversations about environmental justice. But those two things contradict one another, and that's what I talked about today in my public input. And so the concept of environmental justice is that in a lot of parts of the country, and in Texas in particular, there have been laws that segregated people based on race. And in a lot of cases, when people were geographically segregated, forced to live on one side of town, or in a certain part of the state, they were also co-located with sources of pollution, right? And so some communities have had to bear a burden of pollution for more generations than people who have the privilege of being classified as white, right? And so that's the basic concept. But importantly, when the Railroad Commission passed its Chapter 5 carbon dioxide rules in 2023, it required some additional outreach for environmental justice communities and for limited English-speaking household communities. But it never defined the term environmental justice. We had asked the commission in our comments to set down a definition that considered disproportionate impacts on certain communities and cumulative impacts of pollution on certain communities. And that just means that if a community is already being hit by some form of pollution, you have to consider that before you add another source of pollution on top of that community. And so these are things that are data driven and scientific and quantifiable, and have a huge impact on public health, and people's access to a good quality of life, right? And we want these policies to acknowledge that. I also talked about this landmark civil rights case, Hernandez v. Texas. This was a case that was argued by attorney Gus Garcia back in 1954. My dad was an attorney, and my dad was always talking about Gus Garcia, and so this is a thing that was kind of like top of mind for me. But the case itself was about juries being representative, right? And so at the time, there was no policy specifically prohibiting Mexican Americans from serving on juries, but in the past 25 years, none had served on juries in Texas. And so this case was passed and required equal representation under the law, and specifically allowed civil rights to be applied to Mexican Americans just as they were being applied to Black people in the state, and federally. Let's see, what else did I want to talk about? I guess that was most of it. What else, SJ? What else should we talk about?
I appreciated the input that you did give today, and I thought that example was really helpful to see how color blindness actually can really lead to outcomes that are absolutely not colorblind, that are absolutely biased and unfair. And so thank you for pointing that out. And also, when you were speaking about environmental justice specifically and the co-location of relegating people to only live in certain areas, and that's also where pollution is often dumped or is happening. Those patterns are still with us, and it reminded me of Robert Bullard's work, and he's often called like the father of environmental justice, and he's a Texan and is still really active doing this work. So I just think it's a good time to plug the incredible research that he's done to kind of bring this whole issue to light and connect the dots and present that to the broader world.
Yeah, Dr. Bullard and Dr. Beverly Wright were some of the first people to map out what was happening. And so they were able to demonstrate that in certain census block groups with higher concentrations of people of color, there were also higher concentrations of pollution. And so this is something that has been observed, it's been documented, it's real, and it's important that our state and federal government acknowledge the realities that we're living under, and not, promote policies that encourage us all to be quiet about it. And I think that's where what I'm feeling right now is the importance of us continuing to talk about these issues and educate about these issues and not self-censor just because an executive order came through saying we're not doing DEI anymore. And so, they can't force us to stop using certain words. These are realities, and we need to continue to educate and continue to talk about it.
And I also appreciate you connecting it to the carbon capture and storage, the Chapter 5 CO2 rules. That is under the Railroad Commission's purview, and there is a part in it where they don't define environmental justice, but they mention it. And so can you talk about like what that ask was that you included?
And we had asked for a lot in those Chapter 5 rules. We went through a process with looking at the way the commission is planning to issue those carbon dioxide injection well permits. And we thought, really at every step of the way, you could do an analysis. You could make sure that companies are mitigating any extra impacts on people. You could really like incorporate this throughout the permit. They didn't take any of our recommendations. They kind of made it as simple as possible. And the only area where this shows up in the rule is in a requirement for operators to do a little bit of additional outreach when they're providing notice to communities that a permit has been applied for and that they can participate in a public hearing. And so, and it doesn't really go into a lot of detail in defining what that outreach has to look like. And so, there's still a lot of like looseness in this rule. There's still a lot of gray area. The fact that the Railroad Commission has not defined this term in its own rule, and the fact that they were waiting on the EPA to tell them how to define it and what to do there, I think opens up the ability for community members to come in and say, hey, we want to participate in a process to develop guidance on what environmental justice means to us in the state of Texas, because we are experiencing this and we want to be considered. And so we shouldn't limit ourselves to what these executive orders are saying, what they're coming out with. We can still speak up for what we need and what we want here.
Awesome. And so now I think this underscores the need for speaking up for what we need and what we want at the Capitol. So we have been teasing this throughout this conversation about our Capitol visit coming up on February 26th and 27th. Let's share everything we have. What are we doing at the Capitol? And also our organizing director Marte is on the call as well, so they may be able to come off mute and give us some information too. But let's kind of chat about what we're doing next week.
Yeah, Marte, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to talk, go ahead and raise your hand and I can let you do it. But I'll kind of get us started. So next week we're having a Capitol visit. We're bringing our supporters out. I'm seeing a thumbs up from out there. I'm going to take that as keep going. So if y'all want to join us, you can RSVP for that. I'm sure it's on our social media pages. We can reimburse for travel expenses if you are coming from a place that is not Austin, Texas, and you need some support there. But we'll do a little training in the evening on February 26th from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. And we'll just talk through what our priorities are in the legislature and more around like orphan wells, carbon capture and storage. And we'll also give some training on like what it's like to talk to legislative staff, what it's like to kind of circulate ideas and educate legislators about what you're going through, how to tell your story, things like that. Then on the 27th, it'll be a full day of visits to legislative offices. So we'll make sure that you get to go to your representative and your senator, and then we'll also make sure that you go to other key folks like in the House Energy Resources Committee or the Senate Natural Resources Committee. Those are the two committees in the legislature that consider issues related to the Railroad Commission. But it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be really cool. There's a great just group of people that are going to be joining us from all different parts of the state, and I think it's going to be really fun. So we're looking forward to it.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and drop the RSVP in the chat on Facebook Live where we're streaming this. So hopefully folks can see that RSVP form in real time to talk cleaning up oil and gas. And do you want to maybe go into some of those policy recommendations that we're really prioritizing this time around, or where we're feeling like there might be momentum from our legislators?
Yeah, so we Commission Shift wrote a report in 2022 that outlined 10 recommendations for eliminating orphaned wells and sites in Texas. And out of that list of 10, one of the things that has come through the most is just the fact that there are so many inactive wells in the state that still have active operators. And so we were talking about the plugging extensions earlier and how operators can get their operator report revoked and their ability to operate revoked. But a lot of operators continue to get plugging extensions year after year, almost indefinitely. And so we've been advocating for just a limit, you put a 5-year limit on it, no more plugging extensions after that. And like, let's make sure the operator plugs their own well and we're not just waiting for the wells to get orphaned. And so there was a bill that came out that proposed a 15-year limit. That conversation is happening in the legislature right now. But I think, the most important thing for anyone that's going to join us on these Capitol visits is just to tell your own story, to talk about ways that you've been impacted if you have, or just what's important to you. What do you want to see from the Railroad Commission? And so that's what we're hoping to do. I think the other priority is around carbon capture and storage. And so there was a bill that came through last session. I think it's been refiled, but I haven't had a chance to look at it this session. But it would have prevented people affected by facilities along the carbon capture and storage supply chain from filing any claims against a company if they were injured by a pipeline or an injection well, particularly for non-economic damages. And so a non-economic damage could be like disfigurement or loss of mental function or loss of companionship, things like that. And so we were pretty concerned about that, and we'll be talking to legislators about that as well.
That's helpful to know because one thing I have learned with Commission Shift is with carbon capture and storage, when things go wrong, they can go extremely wrong. And there are lots of real life cases of people suffering the kind of losses and damages that you're describing because of asphyxiation. I think that's what you're referring to with like loss of mental capacities or companionship. You can have life-altering consequences for these leaks. Not to mention groundwater contamination potentially for what happens below the ground. So that sounds like one of the bad bills that we saw last legislative session or something similar getting filed again potentially.
And it might be different this year, so I don't want to speak too soon about what we think about it.
Yeah. But people will have a chance to learn all about these issues and get up to speed with us through our orientation at the Capitol. And we even have some resources coming out soon, some one-pagers, some explainers. And if you can't make it in person, we are going to have an action kit. And so look out for that because it's a way for you to take action from wherever you are. So we're going to want to see people calling their legislators and advocating for these kinds of solutions. We're going to have a whole script and step by step what you need to know to take action from your house. And that way we're going to have as many voices as possible on the 27th, contacting their offices and talking about oil and gas cleanup and how Texas should be proactive. I feel like that's kind of the theme of a lot of what we're talking about is being proactive and doing the right thing because you can and you have the power to. So that takes us through, I think, just about everything. This has been a whirlwind of a catch up, and it's been fun to be on this call again. It's our first one of the year. So I think this will be the first of more to come. And as always, please check out commissionshift.org. for all of these updates and sign up for our newsletter. We pack it full of lots of information, lots of goings-ons, events, RSVP opportunities, action opportunities, and things like that. So thanks, Virginia, for joining. I'll let you, if there's anything else you want to add, feel free to jump in. And thanks,
I've
everyone.
talked enough.
So thanks everyone for joining this call, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.